For decades, laws and customs enforced separate schooling, most notably under the Jim Crow system, embedding inequality deep into public education. What appeared on paper as separate was never truly equal. Behind schoolhouse doors, children were divided not by ability or ambition, but by race and social status, a division that shaped destinies long before adulthood began. In many communities, classrooms told a silent story of imbalance. Some schools had new textbooks, well-trained teachers, and safe buildings filled with opportunity. Others struggled with overcrowded rooms, outdated materials, and limited support. These differences were not accidental. They were the result of deliberate policies and social norms that decided, from an early age, whose future would be nurtured and whose would be neglected. Education is more than reading and math. It is the foundation of confidence, possibility, and voice. When access to quality schooling is restricted, the effects reach far beyond childhood. Careers are limited, economic stability becomes harder to achieve, and entire communities feel the long-term impact. Generations grew up carrying the weight of an unequal start, even as they worked tirelessly to overcome it. Yet this story is not only about injustice, it is also about awareness, resilience, and the importance of remembering. Understanding how segregated schooling shaped the past helps explain why educational gaps still exist today. It challenges us to question systems that appear neutral but may still produce unequal outcomes. In this channel, we explore these hidden chapters of history to better understand the present and imagine a fairer future. If you find value in stories that uncover overlooked truths and connect history to today's world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive. The inequality woven into segregated schooling did not end at the schoolhouse door. It became visible in every detail of daily life inside the classroom. If the opening chapter of this story revealed how laws and customs divided children by design, the next chapter shows how that division translated into profoundly different educational experiences. In schools created for marginalized communities, the promise of learning was often undermined by a steady absence of the resources that make education truly transformative. Many students entered classrooms where time seemed frozen. Textbooks were old, sometimes missing pages, often stamped with the names of other schools that had discarded them years earlier. Lessons were built around materials that no longer reflected current knowledge, while students elsewhere were introduced to new ideas, updated science, and expanding worlds of possibility. This quiet transfer of hand-me-down books sent a powerful, unspoken message. Some students were expected to move forward, while others were expected to make do. The buildings themselves reinforced this divide. Leaking roofs, broken windows, and overcrowded rooms were common features, not temporary setbacks. Heating failed in winter, and ventilation was scarce in warmer months, making concentration a daily challenge. These physical conditions shaped how students felt about school long before a teacher spoke. When a learning environment signals neglect, it becomes harder for young minds to imagine futures built on opportunity and choice. Teacher support followed a similar pattern of imbalance. Many educators in segregated schools were deeply committed, working long hours under difficult circumstances because they believed in their students. Yet they were often paid less, given fewer training opportunities, and asked to teach larger classes with minimal assistance. Passion alone could not compensate for systemic neglect. Without adequate support, even the most dedicated teachers struggled to provide the individual attention that helps students grow in confidence and skill. These material shortages did more than limit academic outcomes. They shaped daily interactions and expectations. Students learned quickly that success required resilience beyond the classroom. That effort alone might not be rewarded equally. Over time, this reality influenced how children saw themselves and their place in the world. Education, which should have expanded horizons, instead became a reminder of imposed boundaries. The effects extended far beyond graduation. Limited access to advanced courses, laboratories, libraries, and counseling meant fewer pathways to higher education and skilled careers. As students moved into adulthood, the educational gaps created in childhood translated into economic and social disparities that were difficult to escape. What began as unequal funding evolved into unequal life chances, reinforcing patterns already established by segregation itself. This chapter of the story connects directly to the opening, where separation was presented as policy and tradition. Here, the consequences become tangible, lived, and deeply human. Segregated schools were not simply separate spaces. They were unequal systems that quietly shaped generations. By understanding how inferior funding, facilities, materials, and support lowered educational quality, we begin to see how structural decisions ripple through time, influencing not only individual lives but the fabric of society itself. As the material shortages of segregated schools shaped daily classroom life, their long-term consequences emerged most clearly in what students were ultimately able to achieve. The absence of adequate funding, facilities, and support did not remain confined to peeling walls or outdated textbooks. It followed students toward the critical milestones that define educational success. Graduation, often seen as a natural step forward, became an uncertain goal rather than an expectation, and for many, the journey ended far earlier than it should have. In these schools, the path to completion was filled with obstacles that students elsewhere rarely encountered. Overcrowded classrooms limited personal guidance, making it easier for struggling students to fall behind without notice. Counseling services were scarce, and academic planning often focused on basic requirements rather than long-term growth. Without clear pathways or encouragement, students were left to navigate complex systems on their own, unsure of what opportunities even existed beyond the classroom. Advanced coursework, when it existed at all, was often out of reach. Subjects that opened doors to higher education: advanced mathematics, laboratory sciences, literature seminars, or college preparatory programs were missing or underfunded, while students in better resourced schools explored challenging ideas and developed critical thinking skills. Those in segregated schools were frequently confined to narrow curricula designed to meet minimum standards rather than expand potential. This quiet limitation shaped expectations on both sides of the classroom, influencing what teachers felt able to offer and what students believed they could achieve. The impact on graduation rates was not a reflection of ability or ambition, but of access. Many students balanced school with family responsibilities or part-time work, yet lacked the academic flexibility or institutional support to stay on track. When setbacks occurred, there were few safety nets to help them recover. Each absence, each failed course, carried heavier consequences, increasing the likelihood that students would leave school before earning a diploma. These early exits had lasting effects. Without graduation credentials or exposure to advanced learning, students entered adulthood with fewer options and limited mobility. Higher education became a distant possibility rather than a realistic goal, and employment opportunities narrowed accordingly. The educational barriers constructed in childhood translated into economic constraints that shaped entire lifetimes, reinforcing cycles already rooted in segregated systems. What makes this chapter especially significant is how seamlessly it connects to the earlier stages of inequality. Inferior resources led to limited instruction, which in turn led to restricted outcomes. The system did not fail by accident. It functioned exactly as it was structured. By offering fewer opportunities to advance, segregated schools quietly determined who would be prepared for leadership, innovation, and influence, and who would be left behind. Seen together, these patterns reveal how education became a gatekeeper of life chances rather than a ladder of opportunity. Graduation rates and access to advanced curricula were not merely academic measures. They were signals of whose futures were being cultivated and whose were being constrained. Understanding this progression allows us to see segregation not as a static condition of the past, but as a process whose effects unfolded over time, shaping generations long after the final school bell rang. Beyond grades, graduation rates, and course offerings, segregation left a deeper and more enduring mark on the inner lives of students. After years spent in under-resourced classrooms and limited academic pathways, many children absorbed messages that were never written on the chalkboard, but were communicated every day through unequal treatment. Segregation did not only shape what students could learn, it shaped how they learned to see themselves. From an early age, students could sense the contrast between their schools and those set aside for others. They noticed the condition of the buildings, the age of the materials, and the expectations placed upon them. Over time, these differences quietly suggested a hierarchy of worth. When children grow up in environments that appear overlooked or undervalued, it becomes difficult to separate external neglect from personal identity. The message was subtle but persistent. Some futures were meant to be expanded, while others were meant to be contained. This constant exposure to inequality influenced self-esteem in ways that were not always visible. Students learned to lower their voices, limit their ambitions, or avoid imagining possibilities that felt out of reach. Even those who excelled academically often carried doubt about whether success truly belonged to them. The absence of encouragement, recognition, and representation reinforced the idea that achievement was an exception rather than an expectation. Aspirations were shaped not only by personal interest but by perceived permission. When advanced programs, mentors, and role models were scarce, students had fewer opportunities to envision themselves as scholars, professionals, or leaders. Dreams that require reinforcement and validation were often left unsupported, slowly fading under the weight of practical constraints and unspoken boundaries. In this way, segregation narrowed not just educational outcomes but the emotional space in which ambition could grow. Identity formation during childhood and adolescence depends heavily on belonging and affirmation. In segregated schools, students were often taught, directly or indirectly, that separation was normal and that inequality was inevitable. This framing made it harder to challenge the system or imagine alternatives. Some internalized the belief that their circumstances reflected personal limitations rather than structural design, carrying this misunderstanding into adulthood. These psychological effects did not remain confined to the school years. As students moved into the wider world, the lessons learned in segregated classrooms influenced how they approached opportunities, authority, and self-expression. Hesitation replaced confidence in unfamiliar spaces, and the fear of overstepping often lingered even when doors appeared to open. The impact of segregation thus traveled alongside individuals, shaping choices long after formal education ended. When connected to the earlier chapters of unequal resources and limited academic pathways, this inner dimension completes the picture of how segregation functioned as a comprehensive system. It restricted material support, narrowed educational options, and quietly reshaped identity. The harm was not only measurable in statistics, but felt in the private negotiations students made with themselves about who they were allowed to become. Understanding this emotional and psychological legacy is essential to grasping the full cost of segregation. It reminds us that educational inequality is not only about access to buildings or curricula, but about dignity, belonging, and the freedom to imagine a future without imposed limits. After years of unequal classrooms, limited opportunities, and the quiet psychological weight carried by students, resistance began to take shape. It did not emerge suddenly or from a single voice, but grew steadily from the shared understanding that separation and inequality were neither natural nor acceptable. Parents, students, educators, and community leaders, shaped by first-hand experience, recognized that the conditions they endured were part of a larger system that could be challenged and changed. For many families, the struggle began with small, deliberate acts. Parents questioned school boards about funding disparities, demanded safer buildings, and asked why their children were denied the same opportunities offered elsewhere. These questions, often met with silence or deflection, gradually transformed into organized efforts. Community meetings became spaces where private frustrations turned into collective resolve, and where the language of fairness and equality gained strength. Students themselves played a central role in this unfolding story. Having lived within the boundaries imposed by segregated education, they understood its impact in intimate ways. Walkouts, boycotts, and peaceful demonstrations reflected a determination to be seen and heard. These actions were not simply about classrooms. They were statements of dignity and self-worth, directly confronting the message that their education mattered less. Legal challenges emerged as another powerful form of resistance. Families, supported by dedicated attorneys and civil rights organizations, brought their experiences into courtrooms, transforming personal hardship into legal argument. Evidence was gathered to show that separate systems consistently produced unequal outcomes, not by chance, but by design. Testimonies revealed how inferior facilities, restricted curricula, and lowered expectations violated the promise of equal opportunity. This long and often exhausting process led to moments of historic significance. Landmark rulings, including Brown, Board of Education, acknowledged what communities had known for generations, that separation in education created inherent inequality. The decision did more than address school policy. It challenged the legitimacy of a system that had shaped material conditions, academic outcomes, and personal identities. It offered legal recognition of the harm already deeply felt. Yet victory in court did not erase the struggle overnight. Implementation was slow and uneven, and resistance to change remained strong in many regions. Still, the ruling marked a turning point in the broader narrative. It validated years of activism and affirmed that the experiences of students and families mattered within the highest levels of law. Placed alongside the earlier chapters of this story, this moment of challenge and change represents a shift from endurance to action. The same communities shaped by underfunded schools, limited pathways, and internalized doubt became agents of transformation. Their efforts demonstrated that segregation was not only a social condition but a choice, and therefore something that could be unmade. This chapter reminds us that progress is rarely granted freely. It is claimed through persistence, courage, and the belief that education should expand lives rather than confine them. The legal victories of the past stand as evidence that collective action can interrupt even the most entrenched systems, reshaping the future while honoring the struggles that came before. The legal victories that followed years of activism promised a new chapter, one where the barriers shaping classrooms and futures would finally begin to fall. Court rulings affirmed that separation in education was incompatible with equality, and for a moment, it seemed as though the long arc of the story was bending toward lasting change. Yet as communities soon discovered, altering laws did not automatically transform the structures that surrounded everyday life. Segregation, though no longer openly mandated, found ways to endure through less visible but equally powerful mechanisms. Neighborhoods became one of the most influential forces shaping the new educational landscape. Patterns of housing, shaped over decades by economic pressures and local decisions, determined where families lived and, by extension, where children went to school. School boundaries often mirrored residential lines, recreating separation without ever naming it as such. What had once been enforced by statute was now reinforced by geography, making inequality appear natural rather than constructed. Funding systems further deepened this divide. Schools tied closely to local resources inherited the economic realities of their surrounding communities. Areas with greater wealth were able to maintain modern facilities, smaller class sizes, and broader academic offerings, while less affluent neighborhoods struggled to sustain basic programs. These disparities echoed the earlier conditions of segregated schooling, reminding families that equal protection under the law did not always translate into equal investment in practice. Policy shifts over time also played a role in reshaping the promise of integration. Oversight measures weakened, and enforcement became less consistent, allowing old patterns to quietly reemerge. Programs designed to promote diversity were scaled back or abandoned, often framed as neutral adjustments rather than meaningful reversals. Without sustained commitment, the progress achieved through legal action proved fragile. For students, the consequences felt familiar. Many returned to classrooms that resembled those of earlier generations, not because segregation was officially endorsed, but because the systems surrounding education continued to sort opportunity unevenly. The psychological effects described in earlier chapters resurfaced in new forms. As children again learned to associate their school environments with limits rather than possibility. This persistence revealed an uncomfortable truth. Segregation was never solely a legal problem. It was a network of interconnected practices that extended beyond courtrooms into housing markets, budget decisions, and public priorities. By addressing only one element, society left intact the conditions that allowed separation to adapt and survive. Seen in the context of earlier struggles, this chapter underscores the complexity of change. The courage of activists and the significance of landmark rulings remain undeniable, but their achievements required ongoing reinforcement to reshape lived reality. Without it, the same inequalities that once defined segregated schools continued under new names and new justifications. This stage of the story challenges us to rethink what progress truly means. It asks whether equality can be sustained without deliberate effort, and whether systems built over generations can be undone without continuous attention. The persistence of segregation after legal victory serves as a reminder that history does not move in straight lines, and that the work of building fair education systems extends far beyond the moment a ruling is announced. Addressing what many have come to call lost generations requires more than remembering the past. It demands a conscious effort to repair what history has left behind. The story of segregated education, from enforced separation to unequal resources, limited opportunities, and lasting psychological impact, reveals how deeply inequality can shape lives over time. These effects did not disappear with legal victories, and they will not fade on their own. Closing enduring gaps begins with recognizing that the present is inseparable from the past. Equitable funding stands at the center of this effort. Schools cannot fulfill their promise when opportunity depends on location or inherited advantage. Fair investment in facilities, teaching, and learning resources is not an act of charity, but a recognition that education shapes the future of entire societies. When funding is balanced and consistent, classrooms become spaces where potential is cultivated rather than constrained, and where students are measured by their abilities rather than their circumstances. Inclusive policies are equally essential. Education systems must be designed to welcome, support, and challenge every student, ensuring access to advanced coursework, guidance, and safe learning environments. Inclusion is not only about who enters the classroom, but about whose experiences are valued within it. When students see themselves reflected in curricula and leadership, they gain the confidence to imagine broader futures and to participate fully in shaping their communities. Acknowledging historical harm is perhaps the most difficult step, yet it is also the most necessary. The effects of segregation were cumulative, shaping generations through loss of opportunity and diminished expectation. Naming this history does not divide. It clarifies. It allows societies to understand why gaps persist and why equal treatment alone cannot repair unequal foundations. Recognition creates space for accountability and informed solutions rather than denial or indifference. Together, these elements offer a path forward. They shift the focus from blame to responsibility, from symbolic change to structural repair. Addressing lost generations means refusing to accept inequality as inevitable and choosing instead to rebuild systems that expand possibility. It means ensuring that future students inherit classrooms defined by opportunity rather than limitation. As this story comes to a close, its message remains open-ended. The past explains how we arrived here, but the future depends on what we choose to do with that knowledge. Education has always been a powerful force, capable of narrowing or widening the distance between people. When shaped with care, fairness, and awareness, it becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect on this journey through history and its lasting impact. If this story has helped deepen your understanding or sparked new questions, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these important conversations going and allows more stories like this to be shared.